Have you ever dared to ask what happens when holiness descends into the domain of horror? When the purity of eternal light takes its first step into a place where thousands of bound spirits groan in torment. Not in storybooks, not in parables, but in the very real collision between the sacred and the unspeakable? Picture it now, a desolate shoreline, windswept and cursed, with jagged stones like broken teeth lining the coast, and a sky smothered in gray, so thick and low it feels as though the heavens themselves have turned their face away. The sea churns, with a violence not born of weather, but of unrest, a groaning of the deep, like something ancient is stirring beneath the waves, unwilling to sleep. Waves crash like fists upon the rocks, screaming with the voices of those unseen, and in that howling wind there is more than mere sound. There are whispers, too many to count, layered in agony and chained fury, as if the very atmosphere carries the weight of souls that have never known peace. This is no ordinary setting. This is a threshold, a borderland between realms, between life and death, flesh and spirit, light and shadow. And from the distance, a figure approaches. He walks with no fear. His feet touch cursed ground without trembling. He does not carry sword or shield, yet everything around him, the earth, the wind, even the shadows themselves, seem to shrink from his presence. His name is not shouted, but it is known. His footsteps do not echo, yet all creation listens. He is Jesus, the Son, the one sent from above, not to avoid the graveyard of humanity, but to walk straight into its darkest corners. He is not here by accident. He is not here to observe. He is here to confront, to reclaim, to redeem. He carries with him not the might of an army, but the unstoppable authority of heaven. The sky doesn't open, yet the realm of spirits begins to shake. Because where he walks, no chain can remain locked. Where he speaks, even torment must fall silent. This is not a tale of light politely asking for darkness to leave. This is the invasion of the impossible, the arrival of the eternal into a place abandoned by time, the beginning of a confrontation that would echo through dimensions between the voice that said, "Let there be light," and the shrieking defiance of things that had dwelled in shadow too long. And in this first step, this quiet, unwavering step onto cursed soil, there is a promise hidden beneath the dust that no matter how lost, no matter how bound, no matter how buried in chains or caves or screams, there is no darkness so deep that the light of the living one cannot reach in and call a soul home. Night had fallen like a heavy curtain, thick with anticipation and silence laced with something unseen, something waiting. The boat rocked on the dark waters, small and fragile like a leaf trembling above an abyss. The sea, once calm, began to rise, not slowly, but with fury, as if stirred by a rage that went deeper than wind. Waves swelled into monstrous walls, crashing down on the vessel, soaking the disciples who fought against the storm with trembling hands and frantic eyes. They had seen storms before, fishermen by trade, but this was different. The sky did not merely darken, it groaned. The waters did not simply rage. They thrashed as though something ancient and invisible sought to drown not just bodies, but purpose. It was not nature that stirred, but resistance. And through it all, Jesus slept, not in ignorance, not in denial, but in divine stillness. He lay in the stern of the boat, head resting on a cushion, unmoved by the shrieks of men or the screams of water, until the fear of his disciples broke through their restraint and they shook him awake, crying out not with formality, but with raw terror, "Teacher, don't you care that we're about to perish?" And then he rose, not with alarm, not with rebuke, but with a calm so absolute that even the chaos seemed to pause. He stood upon the shifting deck and looked into the storm, not as a man confronting death, but as the very one who once said, "Let there be light." And then, with no chant, no spectacle, only a command full of timeless authority, he spoke to the wind and the waves, "Peace, be still," and the world obeyed. The sea flattened like glass. The wind curled back into the silence from which it came, and in the sudden hush, the disciples did not rejoice. They stared, stunned, asking among themselves, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" But what they did not yet understand was that the storm had been more than weather. It had been a warning, a tremor in the spirit realm, a precursor to something far more terrible. For storms may rage in the sky, but greater ones boil in the unseen. And on the other side of that sea, in the shadows of a region called Gadara, beyond the cliffs and graves, there waited not nature's wrath, but something much older, much darker. As the boat scraped against the shoreline and the disciples stepped onto dry ground, they found no relief. There was no welcome, no warmth, no sound, not even birdsong, only stillness. And that stillness was heavier than thunder. It wrapped around them like a shroud, because the land they had entered did not sleep. It watched. The silence was not empty. It was dense, like breath held too long, like the moment before something shouts. For the enemy had felt him coming. The storm had tried to delay him. The sea had roared in protest. But now he had arrived, and the darkness was afraid. They had only just stepped onto land, but the ground beneath their feet already felt cursed, as though every stone carried the memory of something vile, something buried yet still breathing beneath the surface. This was not a place of the living. It was a cemetery disguised as a hillside, a place where the wind itself had forgotten how to sing. There were no voices of children, no murmurs of market life, only the dry rustle of dead leaves and the distant groan of stones shifting beneath. Invisible weight. The tombs were carved into the cliffs like gaping mouths, hollow and waiting, and among them wandered something once human, now hollowed out by horror. He lived not in homes, but among graves, not beside fire, but in shadows. The townspeople had long since stopped trying to contain him. They had bound him in chains, heavy iron restraints, thick as a man's wrist, and yet he shattered them as though they were threads of dust. No cell could hold him, for the thing inside him could not be caged by hands. His cries echoed through the valley, not like speech, but like the broken sounds of a soul that had long forgotten how to speak. Day and night, his voice tore through the silence, screaming into the sky, into the earth, into the unyielding air. His body bore the marks of torment, wounds not from war, but from within. With sharp stones he gashed his own flesh, not to end his suffering, but perhaps to match the pain he felt inside. His blood mixed with the dust. His hands were always red. His mind shattered. And yet, as the wind shifted, he sensed something. A presence. Not a soldier. Not a priest. Not a curious traveler. Something holy. Something the shadows feared. And from across the field of bones and broken earth, he saw them. No, he saw him. Jesus. And then the scream came, not of rage, but of panic. It was primal, like the roar of a beast backed into the final corner. And the man, if he could still be called that, ran, not with purpose, but with compulsion. His feet tore through dirt and stone. His body lunged forward, not by his own will, but as though dragged by an unseen force desperate to confront what it could not bear to face. The disciples stood frozen, unsure whether to run or hide. But Jesus did not move. He waited, and the man collapsed before him, falling to his knees in the dirt, trembling, breathing like a creature hunted to the end of its strength. But what came next was not a plea from a broken man. It was a voice not of one, but of many, a voice layered, contorted, choking with hatred and fear, as if a chorus of unseen beings were pressing through one throat. The words it spoke were not confused. They were terrified, desperate, furious, piercing the silence like a thunderclap. The voice cried out, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment us." The dirt itself seemed to shudder. The cliffs echoed back the sentence, like creation itself recognized the weight of that name. It was not worship. It was not repentance. It was recognition. Authority had entered their territory, and darkness, at last, was afraid. There was a silence, not peaceful, but loaded, like the final breath before a scream. And in that stillness, Jesus stood unmoved, his presence cutting through the air like light through a storm. The man who had just fallen at his feet trembled, violently, his body contorting not from pain, but from something deeper, conflict, collapse, fragmentation. His eyes rolled with terror, not because he saw danger, but because he had been seen. Then Jesus spoke, not loudly, not with fury, but with piercing authority that made the very ground seem to hold its breath. "What is your name?" The question didn't echo. It didn't need to. It was not spoken to a man. It was spoken to the dominion inside him. And then it answered, not with a single voice, but with many, a dissonant, broken harmony of anguish and rage, layered and twisted like 1,000 mouths forced into one. "We are legion," it said, "for we are many." The words tore through the silence like thunder cracking open stone. This was not poetry. This was not metaphor. This was an open declaration of infestation. This man's soul had become a battlefield for multitudes, not haunted, occupied. The name was a military term, Roman in origin, known to every ear that had heard the crunch of sandals on blood-soaked roads. Legion, 6,000 soldiers trained for conquest, bound in unity, marching in formation to dominate, destroy, and overwhelm. That number now lived inside him, not in armor, not in flesh, but in torment. Each voice a different cruelty, each presence a different chain. And now, all of them spoke at once. The man's body trembled with the weight of their grip. His mind twitched, pulled in every direction. His jaw clenched and slackened in unnatural rhythm. And though he knelt in the dirt, it was not surrender, it was panic. Because the one standing before them was not just a man. He was the interruption, the invasion, the storm they could not silence. And now, exposed, the legion raged. But even in their fury, they begged, because they knew who had asked the question. They recognized the voice that once spoke the stars into motion. They knew the one who had authority not only over flesh and blood, but over spirit and shadow. The voices twisted again, now frantic, pleading, resisting all at once. This was not a man possessed. This was a soul torn into pieces, stretched thin by 1,000 nightmares that had found a single body to feed upon. The moment was not just spiritual, it was apocalyptic. A glimpse into a hidden war that had raged far beyond mortal eyes. A man became a prison, a name became a threat, and a voice, once human, now spoke for an army. Legion, not because it wanted to, but because, before the Holy One, it could not lie. And so it confessed, with a trembling that reached into the air itself, not out of reverence, but because even evil, when truly seen by the light, cannot help but declare what it is. And in that moment, the battlefield was no longer hidden. It had a name, and it had been claimed. There was no shouting, no struggle, no visible chains snapping in the air, but the tension in that moment was unbearable, as if all creation had gone still to witness what was unfolding between heaven and horror. The man remained kneeling in the dust, his body trembling like a tree under storm winds, but it was not his own voice that broke the silence. It was theirs. Legion, no longer hiding behind flesh, spoke again, this time not with defiance, but with desperation. The voices, once proud and mocking, now quivered with dread. "Please," they pleaded, "do not send us into the abyss." The word hung in the air like a curse. The abyss, the deep place of judgment, the bottomless realm reserved not merely for punishment, but for banishment. Not torment of flame, but of distance. A place where influence ends, where evil is not destroyed, but sealed away, cut off, irrelevant, exiled. That was their fear. Not pain, but silence. Not death, but disconnection. The moment had shifted. What once appeared to be a confrontation had become a negotiation, but it was not between equals. It was a desperate appeal to the only authority that mattered. The spirits knew they could not resist him, so they begged for a lesser sentence. "Let us enter the pigs," they said. "Send us there, instead." It was a strange request by earthly standards, grotesque even, but they were not appealing to men. And Jesus, the Word made flesh, did not argue. He did not rebuke or question their motives, because their motives were irrelevant. He wasn't interested in their fate. He was focused entirely on one thing, the freedom of a single soul. The man who had been chained to tombs, who had bled under his own hands, who had lost his name, his mind, and his peace. This man was the purpose. And in that sacred clarity, Jesus granted them leave, not out of sympathy, not because they deserved it, but because mercy moves differently than vengeance. With a single thought, the command was released, not as a concession, but as a declaration that this soul no longer belonged to darkness. And though the spirits believed they had found an escape, they had only found their eviction. Because the decision had already been made, this man was free. not because the demons had gone, but because Jesus had come. And in that moment, on a quiet hillside above a cursed land, between breathless disciples and the whispering tombs, the light did not shout. It acted. The Son of God had not come to bargain. He had come to liberate. And then it happened, not with fire from the sky or the roar of a trumpet, but in a sudden, silent shift, as if the very fabric of the unseen world had been torn and rewritten in an instant. The command had gone forth. The judgment had been spoken. The evil that once anchored itself inside a man now sought a new vessel, and in a blur of spiritual violence invisible to the eye but undeniable in its effects, they left him. The man fell limp, like a prisoner whose chains had been shattered mid-sentence. But the darkness did not vanish. It moved, and the land reacted. From the hillside came a sound no ear had ever heard. 2,000 pigs, grazing just moments earlier in quiet herds, suddenly erupted into chaos. They stiffened, they shrieked, their bodies jolted and twisted, as if electricity had surged through their bones. Their eyes turned wild, red, vacant, not with instinct, but with something else, something foreign, something that didn't belong. The air turned acidic with their panic, dust rising under the frenzy of their hooves. And then they ran, not scattered in fear, but unified in madness, surging forward with the precision of something being driven, pushed from within. Down the slope they charged, heads lowered, screams piercing the valley, every muscle straining in one uncontrollable direction, the cliff. The sea waited below like a grave carved in salt, and the pigs hurled themselves toward it with no hesitation. One after another, hundreds, thousands, a living avalanche. And as they reached the edge, they leapt, not like animals, but like vessels possessed, screaming as they plunged, their bodies tumbling through the air, crashing into the waves below. The sea exploded with motion, foam rising like smoke from a battlefield, and then silence. Not because the horror had lessened, but because it had completed its arc. What had once tormented a man now drowned beneath the waves. The demons had found their exit, but also their end. The hillside, moments ago alive with screams, now lay barren. The ground, once shaking, now stood still. And there, where terror had once made its throne, was a man, lying in the dust, no longer shaking, no longer weeping, but breathing. Just breathing. For the first time in years, the breath belonged only to him. The smell of decay lifted. The stench of death dissolved. The atmosphere itself seemed to exhale. Something ancient had been broken. Something unseen had been cast out. The region was not yet healed, but it had been touched. And on that bloodless battlefield, between shattered stones and wild silence, one soul lay still, not because he was afraid, but because for the first time in so long, he was free. The wind had calmed, the sea had swallowed its scream, and the cliffs no longer echoed with madness. But the greatest silence of all now sat upon the earth, not the silence of nature, but the silence of a man finally at peace. Where once there had been shrieking in chains and bloodied stones, there was now a figure seated gently in the dust, clothed, calm, still. He sat at the feet of Jesus, not as a prisoner, not as a madman, but as a son who had been found. His eyes, once wide with torment and spiraling voices, now reflected clarity, depth, recognition. His hands, once raw from clawing against his own skin, now rested open in quiet stillness. He breathed not in gasps, but in rhythm. His mind was no longer a battlefield. It was a sanctuary, and for the first time in what must have felt like forever, his soul belonged to him again. The man who once roamed the tombs like a shadow, who tore at his own flesh, who lived among the dead, now sat whole, reborn, restored. He had no sword, he had no crown, but the miracle in him spoke louder than thunder. And then, from the edge of the hills, the villagers came. They had heard. The ones who had witnessed the pigs fall into the sea had run to tell others, and now they returned with a crowd, not out of celebration, but curiosity laced with fear. They looked upon the man they once feared, the man whose name they'd erased, whose screams haunted their nights, and they saw him sane, sitting in perfect peace beside the very one who had commanded the storm and the spirits alike. But their response was not awe. It was terror, not because of what they saw in the man, but because of what they saw in Jesus. They had lived their lives near the borders of death, used to the groans in the graveyard, the cries from the cliffs. They had built their lives around the existence of torment, but now holiness stood before them, raw, unfiltered, alive. And holiness does not simply illuminate tombs. It exposes hearts. The same light that freed the possessed man now cast its gaze into the souls of the villagers, and what it found there made them tremble. They were not afraid of demons. They were afraid of divine power, of the kind of purity that sees through masks, that unmasks compromise, that burns through comfortable shadows. And so, instead of embracing the miracle worker, they recoiled. Instead of kneeling, they stepped back, and with whispers laced in unease, they asked him to leave. Not because he had done wrong, but because he had done too much right. The man, who had been set free, watched them. He saw in their eyes the very fear he once carried, the fear of being seen too deeply. But he did not flinch. He looked to Jesus with gratitude that needed no words. In that moment, on that hillside torn by spiritual violence, where pigs had fallen and tombs still stood, there was a man sitting beside the Son of God, no longer captive, no longer shattered, just still. And in that stillness, there was a quiet, thunderous truth. When Christ liberates, the soul rests, even if the world cannot. He sat there at the feet of the one who had shattered his chains and called him back from the brink, his eyes filled with a pleading that words could barely hold. He did not beg for riches or reward, nor did he ask for healing, for he had already received the greatest miracle of all, himself. What he wanted now, with every fiber of his being, was to follow the one who had walked straight into the tombs to find him, the one who had silenced storms and cast out legions with a word, the one who had looked into his madness and called forth peace. "Let me come with you." His voice must have whispered, not in desperation, but in devotion. But Jesus, who saw not just the wounds of a man, but the calling hidden within them, gently shook his head. And with that divine mixture of authority and compassion, he spoke a command that would echo beyond the shores of Gadara. "Go home. Tell everyone what God has done for you." It was not rejection. It was a mission, a sacred trust placed in hands once bloodied, in a voice once hijacked by darkness. The man who had once been a vessel of torment would now become a vessel of testimony. He would not sail with the disciples, but he would carry something greater than sails. He would carry a story, one forged in tombs, freed in waves, and ignited at the feet of the Savior. He did not resist. He did not argue, because something inside him knew this wasn't just about his healing, this was about his purpose. And so he stood, not as a preacher trained in temples, not as a scholar cloaked in robes, but as a man, reborn. He walked back into the villages that had once feared his cries, into streets where children once ran from his shadow, and he spoke, not with eloquence, but with fire. "I was that man," he must have said. "I was lost, I was broken, I was gone. But the Son of God crossed the sea, faced the storm, walked into my tomb, and gave me back my name." And they listened, because they could see it in his eyes. They could hear it in his voice. Not doctrine, but deliverance. Not theory, but transformation. And without even knowing it, he became the first messenger of the gospel among the Gentiles. Long before the apostles would preach to the nations, long before the churches would rise and letters would be written, there was this man, once naked among the graves, now clothed in purpose, walking through a land that had never known the light, carrying it with him, not in books, but in scars. And though his name is lost to history, his echo remains. Because whenever a soul that's been shattered turns around and tells the world what God has done, that echo roars again. And in that lonely, foreign land, the gospel had taken root, not with trumpets or temples, but with the voice of one man who had once been forgotten, now found, and forever lit. And now, as we step away from the windswept cliffs of Gadara and the echoes of a man once broken, we are left not just with a story from long ago, but with a mirror held up to the soul of every listener. Because the truth is, we all carry a legion, not of ancient demons with names in foreign tongues, but of inner voices, regrets, buried pain, habits we cannot shake, wounds we never dared name aloud. Sometimes they scream at night. Sometimes they whisper in the quiet. Sometimes they wear the mask of shame, addiction, bitterness, or silence. They don't always break chains with noise. Sometimes they bind us gently, slowly, invisibly. But they're there, in the graves we avoid, the memories we bury, the parts of ourselves we're afraid to let anyone see. And yet, the story is this: Christ is not afraid of our darkness. He does not flinch from the tombs we dwell in. He does not recoil from the stench of what we've become. He crosses the storm, walks through chaos, and meets us where no one else dares to tread. He sees through the madness, calls out our name, and speaks peace into the war zones of the heart. Where others see ruins, he sees restoration. Where others hear screaming, he listens for the song that could rise once the chains fall. And when his light enters the shadows we've long called home, the darkness trembles, not because it is strong, but because it is exposed. The man in the tombs was not the only one in need of deliverance. We, too, have our caverns. But the message is clear. No shadow is too thick, no legion too many, no scar too deep. The one who commands the storm is also the one who restores the soul. And when he steps in, when he speaks, when he calls us out by name, we don't just survive. We rise. We sit at peace. We become whole. And what once was torment becomes testimony. That is the lesson. That is the invitation. Not just to believe it happened, but to believe it can happen in us. And so the story returns to its silent beginning. A man once lost among the tombs, a soul shredded by voices not his own, possessed not just by spirits, but by despair, by abandonment, by darkness so ancient it seemed eternal. He had been chained by others and by his own past, banished to live among the dead, howling against the sky as if no one heard. But someone did. Someone crossed the raging sea not by accident, but by intent. Someone who knew exactly where the storm would strike and what soul lay buried beneath its waves. And when that man, radiant with power, cloaked in quiet majesty, stepped onto that cursed shore, everything changed. One command shattered the grip of thousands. One word silenced the chaos that had echoed for years. One encounter turned a madman into a messenger. That is not just a miracle of long ago. It is a living invitation. Because this isn't only his story, it could be ours. What if the tombs we've hidden in, the guilt we've carried, the pain we've normalized, what if those aren't our final chapters? What if the same voice that calmed the storm and cast out the darkness is now calling your name? What if the place you feared most, the deepest part of you, the one you keep locked away, is precisely where he wants to bring his light? Not to shame you, not to expose you, but to set you free, to rewrite your ending. The question now is not whether the light can win, it already has. The only question is, will you let it in? Will you let him step into your shadows, your silence, your tombs? Because even now, the light is drawing near. Even now, it stands at the edge of your shore, ready to speak peace, ready to break every chain, ready to call you by the name you thought you had lost forever. So whether you are buried in sorrow or screaming from within a storm, whether your soul feels numb or your heart is on the verge of collapse, hear this: the light is not afraid of your darkness. In fact, it was made to overcome it. Let this be more than a story. Let it be the spark, because the next chapter could be yours. At X Mystery, we do not tell these stories merely to inspire awe, but to awaken something ancient and buried within each of us. Because behind the symbols, behind the battles, behind the light and shadow, there lies a question we believe every soul must face. What if the greatest mystery is not out there, but inside you? This channel was born not out of curiosity alone, but out of a hunger to understand what lies beneath the surface of scripture, of myth, of history, and of the human heart. We do not come as scholars in robes or preachers on high. We come as seekers in the storm, as wanderers who've heard the distant cry of a soul in chains and dared to ask, what if that cry is mine? At X Mystery, we believe there are truths so deep they tremble when spoken, stories so ancient they still echo through our nightmares and dreams, and light so powerful that when it enters, even the most forgotten soul can become the loudest testimony. We believe this because we've seen it in scripture, in history, and perhaps, if you're honest, in yourself. You see, we are not afraid to speak of demons, because we are more afraid of the silence that lets them thrive. We are not afraid to shine light on the tombs, because we know too many people are still living among them. And we are not afraid to talk about the one who crossed the sea, because he didn't just come for the man in chains. He came for all of us. So if something stirred in you as you watched this, if some hidden corner inside you trembled at the mention of darkness being exposed and replaced by light, then this is not just a video. This is a call, a divine interruption, a whisper into your storm. And maybe, just maybe, it's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of your deliverance. This is X Mystery, and we are here, not just to uncover ancient truths, but to remind you that you were never forgotten, that the light is still moving, and that even the deepest tombs are no match for a voice that speaks life. If this resonates with you, stay with us, subscribe, share this light, and above all, let your story be the next mystery revealed.
To continue this journey of discovery and unravel even more fascinating mysteries from around the globe, hit the subscribe button for X Mystery now, and don't forget to turn on the notifications to be the first to watch our new videos.